Hello and welcome to After Office Hours. My name is Evan Carter and I am joined today by the Assistant Professor of Religion down with Westblade. Today we're going to talk about the similarities and the differences between the Bible and American conservatism. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Westblade. Just to start things out, over the past couple years, Hillsdale College has reaffirmed its commitment to Christianity, and it's also traditionally been extremely political. I know Dr. Arnn, President Arnn, has lots of connections in Washington, D.C. and so on. Is this relationship complementary, or in other words, are Christians conservatives necessarily?
I think it is a complementary relationship, but not a necessary relationship. There are conservatives who aren't Christians, there are Christians who aren't conservatives, but there is a nice joining of those, a symbiosis of those here, and it's been true of the school, I think, since the founding of the school, and not just since it's been re-emphasized in the last 10 years or so.
Okay, and would you say that's the same with Christianity and Libertarianism, or Christianity and liberalism? Would those political relationships also be complementary, or?
I think they can be. I fashion myself in some ways more libertarian than conservative, and that's part of an expression of what I take to be a Christian reading of Christian authorities.
Okay. Another thing is that, in large part because of the election of President Trump, and then with all the issues in the Syrian civil war and everything surrounding that, immigration and refugees have come up a lot in conversations lately in political discourse, and many Christians view this as an issue of justice. What does the Bible say in terms of justice, in terms of immigration? What does it say in terms of refugees? I know people bring up books like Jeremiah, or you think of the Exodus with the Jews and then the mixed multitude among the Jews and how they were supposed to act. Is this an issue of justice, or is it a purely political issue?
Well, it can be a purely political issue, but it ought not to be if we understand our place in the history and the tradition of our Judeo-Christian heritage that we celebrate here at Hillsdale. So it's an issue of justice, it's an issue of mercy, and those two, I think, do come together. Sometimes people separate justice and mercy as though they were two competing categories, and God speaks out of two sides of his mouth. But that's only because we take a definition of justice that is anthropocentric, it's human-centered, and we say we're giving people what they deserve, and mercy is giving people what they don't deserve, so they must be different. But if we understand justice on a larger scale as giving credit where credit is due, a kind of garden variety definition of justice, we could ask, where's all the credit due? And it's all due to God. So in some ways, righteousness is the soli deo gloria of the Christian foundation, and so how we treat our immigrants has to do with the glory that we give to God. So, how do we treat them? There's no particular policy that I think flows from that, any more than there's some policy about what I should eat for lunch that flows from my Christianity. I can be a vegetarian, I can eat meat, and I can do both to the glory of God. It's about the benefit to the immigrants, and there are immigrants who have been quoted recently on television saying, you know, real compassion to me would be to let me stay in my own country, and others who really have needs and can't stay in their own country that we ought to welcome in. We also ought to do that, I think, by a kind of lawful way of doing it, and so those who want to ignore the law in order to be merciful, I think, have something of a biblical problem. There are times when we have to overcome our legal obligations by our higher Christian obligations, but those don't need to be in conflict with each other either. I think there are biblical ways of being compassionate to immigrants without having to be scofflaws in the process.
You mentioned that one way people feel like they can have justice or mercy shown to them would be to help them stay where they are in Syria or Iraq or one of those countries. Where would you say that wisdom in terms of national security, if that is an issue, plays into this in terms of the biblical understanding of the issue?
I think that depends upon the day-to-day situation on the ground, and I don't know that I can answer that question generically. With some grand biblical principle, we need to help the people in the conditions where they are, wherever we can, in whatever way we can. So if it's possible to allow them to keep their own homes, I think that's preferable to trying to find them some home in a place where they don't understand the language, where it's harder to find a job. So we ought to try to help them, if they can, to be at home where they've been at home. When that's impossible, then we want to do what we can to show God's mercy to them. And if that means bringing them into the country, there are legal processes by which that can happen. And it can benefit our country to have immigrants come and help us with employment.
Yeah. Something else I wanted to move into was the Bible and welfare. Scripture talks quite a bit about caring for the poor, the widow, the orphan. In the book of Galatians, actually, in the New Testament, Paul says that he's eager to remember the poor. But then in Thessalonians, he also says that those who don't work shouldn't eat. Conservatives typically take statements like this to mean, I will help them on my own or through my church, but I don't want the government doing that, sort of separating the responsibilities of the Christian from the responsibilities of the state. In terms of what Scripture says and your understanding of the context of these passages, what is a biblical approach to welfare? How should Christians look at this?
Well, we're talking about two axes here. One is the conservative liberal axis, and typically the liberal approach is to use collective solutions for things and to see problems at the system level of the state and try to fix the state and try to fix the processes. And conservatives typically are distinct from that in wanting to take individual approaches and voluntaristic approaches. So that's one cross-section that you could take of the approaches to it. The biblical approach, I don't think necessarily corresponds with one or the other of those two things. I think there are biblical things to say about the condition of the state, and there are biblical things to say about the condition of individuals. But for the most part, I think it does put a lot of responsibility on individuals. A welfare system is based upon a state coercing people to give to the state so the state can redistribute funds. And the biblical model never was that way. The biblical model was alms, in which people individually put money straight into the palm of the person who had the needs, and there was no government redistribution in the middle to kind of siphon a bunch of stuff off for things that may not be actually helping the poor. So alms and gleaning, these were individual ways, and they were based upon people's responsibility to help the poor, and weren't based upon the rights of the poor that leveraged those with the rich to give to them. And we are in a culture that is grounded in rights. Sometimes I lament the fact that we have a Bill of Rights. I wish we had had a Bill of Responsibilities, because I think Scripture calls us to be the responsible ones and doesn't call the victims to call us on our obligation to them because of their rights. This is what gives us a very litigious culture. This is what gives us a victim culture in which the winning suit is always victimhood. I can take you to court because I'm losing out on something and you owe me. And that entitlement mentality is, I think, a long way away from the biblical model of how we ought to be motivated in helping people.
But on the other hand, if somebody said to you, the Bible also says that give to Caesar what is Caesar's and God what is God's, and people aren't going through with their responsibilities to pay alms and to take care of the poor on their own, and the government steps in, what would you say to a person who's coming at from that approach?
Well, I would say we should pay our taxes, and I would say that the government ought to take its responsibilities seriously. But you open a door to a kind of a large invitation for the government to do all kinds of other things besides the pretext of trying to help the poor, and the government gets in the business of trying to help itself and grow itself and preserve itself. And mercy has gotten lost in that process, and then when that happens, I think a biblical perspective on welfare has gotten lost in that. So we need to be, I say with a kind of libertarian instinct that I think I have taken from Scripture, smaller government is probably safer, but some government is probably inevitable. But the role of government, I think, is better the more limited it can be.
Sure, and you also brought something up that I can't pass over. You said you wish that we didn't have a Bill of Rights, but a Bill of Responsibilities. Can you expand upon that a little bit more? Because the Bill of Rights is something that's celebrated at Hillsdale College. We spend time covering it. Why would a Bill of Responsibilities, from a Christian perspective, from your understanding, be better, maybe?
Rights are about my entitlement, and responsibility is about my grace, to use the theological term for it. So if we're going to model ourselves after God, God doesn't give to me because I have rights that entitle me to things from God. God gives because he is an overflowing fountain of surplus of benefit that he loves to give. And that's what I think he calls me to do. That's where his joy is. That's where my joy is going to be. So if I focus more upon my responsibilities, and not just my responsibilities as duties, my responsibilities as the joy of being human. My responsibility is to be a philanthropist, because that's how God made me. That's where I finally scratch my deepest human itch. I'm going to be a happier person that way than if I'm always being leveraged by other people and have other people treat themselves like victims, and everybody's racing to be a victim. This is not making other people happy. I don't think this is an aspect of mercy. So when rights are a kind of proxy for the responsibilities that I have, I understand rights and I honor other people's rights. But when that becomes the foundation of the way that we think about our human relationships with each other, I think there is danger down that way.
Sure. Moving on, another issue that many Christians are interested in is criminal justice. The justice of God is a major theme in books of the prophets in the Old Testament. Paul talks quite a bit about righteousness in the book of Romans and his other epistles. Yet in the book of Habakkuk, the prophet Habakkuk actually prays to God that in the midst of this, God would not forget mercy. So you have mercy, you have justice. Politically conservative Christians seem to have lots of different thoughts on this topic, ranging Protestant, Catholic, and so on. Does the Bible have a coherent message on righteousness and justice? And secondly, does this have anything to do with our government's justice system?
Yes and yes. The Bible has a very coherent view of righteousness, the kind of righteousness I was describing before, where God is getting all the glory. That's justice. All the credit going where all the credit is due. When God gets the glory, that's when justice happens. And God gets the glory when he is in his retributive mode of giving us our due. He's also in a kind of mode of getting glory and being righteous when he is overflowing with his surplus and grace to us, because that's drawing attention to his glorious character, his glorious ability to meet all needs. So there is probably a greater coherence in justice from a biblical point of view than there is in the usual human focused view of justice. And that's the kind of justice that I think is coming to expression in Amos, who says we need to be thinking about justice. I think it's empty rhetoric when we say, I love God, but I don't care about my brothers and sisters. If I love God, I love the way God is. And God is full of grace, overflowing mercy to other people. And I want to be like that. I want to be overflowing in the gifts that I've received for the benefit of other people. That's where I'm going to be the happiest. So in being merciful to other people, that's justice. In giving people retributive justice that might be their due, that's also justice. And those things come together in a biblical understanding of this.
Yeah, and you mentioned that there's some incoherence, you believe, in human justice and the human understanding of that. Could you sort of lay that out? Where is the incoherence, you believe, in human justice?
Well, it's not so much, it's that we are separating what we take to be justice from mercy. We're saying we're either having to be just or we're going to be merciful, as though those are competing categories. And biblical view of justice unites those things in the glory of God by saying that we can accomplish justice when we are retributive, we can accomplish justice when we are merciful. And that justice is making sure that God's giving all the honor that is due to his great name.
Sure.
So that's what the prophets, I think, are being called to. That's the model for government, monarchy it was in Israel, but when Israel calls for a king, God says, fine, you can have a king, as long as that king is going to treat you the way that I've treated the king. It became the role of the prophets like Amos and Hosea and Habakkuk to keep the king in that proper relationship to God so that he would be in proper relationship to his people. Mm-hmm. That's still true for democracies, it's true for every kind of government.
For presidents.
Yes. That the role of government is to work for the benefit of the people. And it's a pagan view of government that says the people are here to work for the benefit of the government. And so when the government turns us into employees who work for them and who get paychecks back from them, and every April 15th, the government will tell us how much we're allowed to keep of our hard labor, that is a pagan view of government that is not informed by the Bible. The Bible tells us that the government ought to be godlike. And Isaiah tells us, Isaiah 64:4, one of my favorite verses, eye has never seen or ear ever heard of a God like the God of this Bible. In what respect? In the sense that God works for us while we wait for him. Every other relationship of God and every other religion I'm aware of, God created people to be his slaves, to be his workers. The gods can sit up on Olympus and eat grapes and take it easy because the people are doing all the heavy lifting down there. And this is a God who loves to be the worker. In a sense, he's our employee, but he's our patron employee, the way that my doctor is my employee. Mm-hmm. He calls the shots, he's still my boss, he tells me what to do, and I listen to his advice because I trust this doctor. That's where faith plays its role. But the doctor's doing the work for me, even when I'm out there busily taking my pills and doing my therapy. That's the doctor working for me. And this is how governments ought to understand themselves, as entities that work for the benefit of the people.
I think we have time for one more question. Free speech is a very, very hot topic across campuses. It's come up this year at Hillsdale, but in much more violence at other campuses. Berkeley comes to mind with $10,000 or maybe $100,000 in damages when a conservative speaker, Milo Yiannopoulos, tried to come and they shut it down. The Bible talks quite a bit about words as well as the tongue. The book of James talks about the wicked things and the good things that the tongue is capable of. And then Ephesians 4 explicitly talks about not letting unwholesome things come out of the mouth. So politically speaking, conservatives have a staunch support of free speech traditionally. Where does the Bible land on this issue, or where should it come in?
Well, the Bible's first of all going to define what freedom is. And freedom isn't necessarily license to do whatever we want to, which would open the door to some of the speech that you rightly pointed out the Bible doesn't approve of. Freedom has to do with making ourselves happy tomorrow. That's when I'm most free. When the decisions I make today work out for my benefit and not for my destruction. That's when I'm free. And sometimes that's constrained by laws. Sometimes that's constrained by responsibilities. And that constraint is my freedom in a kind of ironic way. So when we want to talk about freedom of speech, it doesn't mean necessarily license for speech. It means that I want to speak in such a way that when I look back upon what I said tomorrow, when I look back upon what I said in 10 years, I'm going to be glad about what I said because it benefited who I talked to. Sure. So there's a more fundamental understanding of what freedom is in this notion of free speech. Now, we ought to also have very thick skins because of the promises of God, who will take care of me no matter what happens. I can be the persecuted church and I will still stand for my faith. Mm-hmm. I can be the persecuted person who doesn't like what I'm hearing on the platform. And because of the promises of God, I've got the thick skin that can sit there and listen to opinions that I disagree with without having to burn a building down because I didn't like it, without taking offense because I didn't like it.
Sure.
So Hillsdale, we have welcomed in a lot more diversity of speakers than you might get at the average campus today that has confined itself to a very narrow set of political correctness in the speakers that they will approve of.
Well, thank you for being with us today, Dr. Westblade. We have come to the end of our season, but if you'd like more videos like this, you can see them on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like more hard-hitting news from the Collegian, you can follow us on Twitter or go to our website, www.hillsdalecollegian.com. As I said, this is the final episode of our season. We hope you enjoyed watching it as much as we did producing it. Until next time, I'm Evan Carter.